Imagine being 8 years old, your work uniform, a ragged shirt and trousers you'll never see clean again, and your job is shimmying up a chimney the size of a drain pipe. The Victorian-era chimney sweep was a job straight out of a nightmare, reserved for kids who didn't know what they'd be signed up for, and frankly, probably didn't get a choice. Jimmy, let's call him, is handed a scraping tool, prodded to climb into the narrow, sooty shaft, and told to keep scraping until he's done. Done with what, you ask? Breathing? Absolutely. Climbing up a chimney in pitch-black darkness wasn't just an odd workout routine, it was a survival test, where one wrong move could leave you jammed between bricks or slipping down with a face full of soot and a scraped-up spine. But Jimmy couldn't even complain. He'd been poked and prodded with sticks if he dared slow down. Think American Ninja Warrior, but with zero safety equipment and soot so thick he could practically chew on it. Some sweeps like Jimmy developed something uniquely horrifying called Chimney Sweep's carcinoma, a type of cancer discovered because of this job. This is how your career ends when it starts in a chimney. You literally die from work before you can finish scraping the ash out of your lungs. And after all this, Jimmy's reward was probably a pat on the head, a bit of bread, and lungs that sound like you swallowed a wood stove. Next time you grumble about working overtime, just picture Jimmy wedged in a brick tunnel, scratching at soot until his master calls it a day. In the end, being a Victorian chimney sweep was a career opportunity no one wanted, but plenty endured. One deadly climb at a time. Now picture yourself signing up for a job that's essentially a dog poop scavenger hunt through the streets of Victorian London. That's the life of a pure finder. These brave souls, often older women or young children, trudged through filthy alleys, equipped with nothing but a sack and the faint hope of a few coins in return for scooping up pure, or as we'd call it today, dog droppings. Why? Because the Victorian soap industry needed it. Yes, back then, dog poop was a hot commodity for tanning leather and soap making. And if you didn't mind getting your hands dirty, literally, this was your chance to join the poop economy. Picture poor Maggie, an elderly pure finder with a burlap sack and a nosecloth, because even the Victorians knew when something stank. She'd start her day with a sniff and squint, scanning cobbled streets for the latest deposits left by strays and working dogs. Some days were slim pickings, which meant Maggie had to fight off competitors to claim her piles. Poop wars were real, and turf disputes weren't uncommon. On a rainy day, the job got even messier. Picture Maggie slogging through puddles, trying not to slip while scooping up what's now a mushy disaster. Every splash was a direct hit to her dignity, and while sanitation gloves didn't exist yet, neither did vaccines, so yes, every day was a gamble with infections and illnesses. Modern sanitation workers might deal with waste, but at least they have gloves, gear, and a society that respects the effort. Pure finders? They had none of that. They worked tirelessly in filth, earning just enough to eat, and then, well, finding more pure the next day. For every Victorian soap bar, there was a pure finder's contribution, a true unsung hero of hygiene, one scoop at a time. In Victorian London, there was a last resort career for the desperate, being a mudlark. Imagine this. You're an 8-year-old Victorian-era kid named Johnny, not off playing stickball, but knee-deep in the Thames at low tide, elbowing through sludge like it's Black Friday at a Victorian flea market. Congratulations! You're a mudlark, one of the lowest jobs in London. Essentially a human magnet for lost, filthy, semi-sellable scraps. Your office? The Thames riverbank, which is less scenic waterfront and more dumping ground for London's least charming leftovers. Mudlarks had one job: sift through the mud for treasures. Read bits of metal, stray buttons, the occasional coin, and hope to make enough pennies for a chunk of stale bread. On good days, you might find something like a rusted nail worth a penny. On a great day, maybe a coin, which, let's be real, you'd spend instantly because you were always one bread crust away from actual starvation. And oh, the workplace hazards. The Thames wasn't just water. It was a mix of sewage, animal remains, and delightful industrial runoff. Cuts and scrapes were inevitable, and with no antibiotics, even a tiny wound could turn you into a walking infection. One mudlark, Lucky Jim once sliced his foot open on a broken bottle and walked around with an infected toe the size of a sausage. His nickname? Pure irony. If hypothermia or tetanus didn't get you, there was always the quicksand-like muck ready to devour your shoes, assuming you even had them. Johnny here lost his left boot in the mud on Tuesday. And no, the river didn't give it back. Today, people glamorize mudlarking as a quirky hobby, but back then, it was the dirtiest, riskiest gig around. And let's face it, Victorian London wasn't exactly handing out medals for bravery, or any clean water for that matter. Being a Victorian resurrectionist, or grave robber, was like being a 19th century version of a delivery man, if what you delivered were stolen corpses. When medical schools needed fresh bodies for anatomy classes, these enterprising folks stepped in, grabbing newly buried cadavers and resupplying doctors with a steady flow of, well, expired inventory. Let's just say this job wasn't for the squeamish, nor the law-abiding. To pull off a heist, resurrectionists had to be fast and efficient. Imagine sneaking into a cemetery by moonlight, with nothing but a shovel and a will to avoid jail time. They'd dig a narrow shaft at the head of the grave, break into the coffin, and yank out the body, hoping nobody caught them mid-scoop. Because if they did, they faced more than just a bad Yelp review. The penalty for grave robbing was serious, with jail, flogging, or even the gallows waiting if they got too greedy. Take the infamous William Burke and William Hare of 1820s Edinburgh. Technically a bit before Victorian times, but they were trendsetters. They started by selling bodies to anatomy schools, but when supply ran low, they simply created their own, by smothering folks who checked into their boarding house. Efficiency, right? Their 16 supplies earned them a tidy profit until they got caught, ending their dark entrepreneurial streak. Burke was hanged, ironically supplying one final dissection class. But grave robbing was risky beyond the threat of the law. The stench alone was hazardous, and corpses could carry diseases. Rumor has it grave robbers would carry vinegar-soaked rags over their noses, hoping the smell of decay didn't send them to an early grave themselves. So the next time you see an old cemetery, remember, for every grave, there may have been a Victorian delivery specialist looking to cash in. Talk about a hands-on job with a view of eternity. Working as a leech collector in the Victorian era was about as glamorous as a mud wrestling match, except with more bloodsuckers and fewer spectators. These intrepid individuals waded into murky swamps, armed with jars and a healthy dose of desperation, trying to catch leeches that were considered the medical equivalent of gold. Yes, in a time when bloodletting was deemed a miracle cure for everything from migraines to melancholy, leeches were the rock stars of the medical world. Let's see Thomas, a leech collector with an adventurous spirit, proudly struts into town after a long day of fishing for leeches. He recounts his tales to anyone who will listen. "You should have seen me. I snagged 10 leeches before breakfast." But the reality? Thomas probably had a half dozen clinging to his own leg as he recounted his epic tale, looking more like a man who'd lost a fight with an octopus than a daring collector. One slip of the foot, and suddenly he's starring in his own horror movie. Attack of the Slimy Bloodsuckers. Imagine the sights and sounds of a leech collector's workday. The squelching mud, the buzzing mosquitoes, and the occasional, "Ew, what's that?" as they pulled a particularly tenacious leech off their own arm. The job also had its risks. Standing in stagnant water is a great way to catch more than just leeches. Collectors often returned home with not just leeches, but also infections and a few extra pounds of swamp muck, earning a reputation for being the stinkiest workers in town. Despite the ick factor, leech collectors were essential to the booming medical market, selling their slippery finds to doctors who thought draining blood would balance the humors. So the next time you complain about your job, just remember Thomas knee-deep in muck, fishing for leeches because nothing says hard work quite like a career that involves wrestling with nature's own blood-sucking circus. Victorian matchstick makers may as well have been training for a life in pyrotechnics. Danger was a part of the job description. Imagine a workshop resembling a mix between a lumberyard and a chemistry lab, where workers were tasked with crafting tiny sticks of explosive potential. The atmosphere was so thick with the smell of chemicals that you'd think you walked into a mad scientist's lair. The main ingredient was white phosphorus, a substance more dangerous than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. It made matches easy to light, but also led to a delightful condition called phossy jaw. Picture a young matchmaker named Eliza, who started her day cheerfully whittling wood and ended up with a jaw so sore that she could only eat mashed potatoes for weeks. One day she joked with her friends, "At least I'll save money on dental floss. These gaps can fit a whole carrot." Unfortunately, that was her only consolation as she dealt with chronic pain and social stigma. And then there was the working environment. Dark, dusty, and filled with the sounds of snapping wood and sputtering matches. You could almost hear the dramatic theme music as workers dodged the occasional spark that could ignite the whole place like a fireworks show gone wrong. Another worker, Tom, recounted, "It felt like a game of dodgeball, but instead of balls, it was fire, and the stakes were my eyebrows." He once narrowly escaped a flaming box that caught fire as he packed it. Yet despite the health hazards and near misses, matchstick makers fueled the Victorian economy, supplying the must-have item for everything from cozy candlelit dinners to impromptu bonfires. So the next time you flick a match, remember the brave folks who risked it all to keep your fires burning bright while battling tooth decay and the occasional fireball.